Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Crivello, CEO and founder of Lindy, the personal AI assistant that can help with tasks and calendar management, email drafting to contract sending and beyond. Flo, I'm so excited to chat with you and get to know not only your background, your experience, but also, what you're working on at Lindy, especially as you mentioned before the show, before we hopped on the recording, how much AI has really boomed and really come to the forefront of a lot of different, not only companies, but also in popularity and people are using it in so many different ways. I mean, it's really we found it not only to, not in a replacement sense, but we found it in a way to kind of enable and support the mundane tasks and other things that are less of the creative kind of side that a lot of people just either tend not to like to do or tend to take too much time outside of the other things. But we'll go into AI and what that means for kind of a broader scheme of individuals and also how you've been able to help people. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
Yeah, so before Lindy, I was founder of a startup called Teamflow. We were building a virtual office for remote teams right at the peak of the pandemic. And before then, I was an engineer and then a product leader at Uber, where I was for almost 5 years.
And it's interesting to think about your product experience being able to build and identify ways to really create kind of a simple process with a lot of complex solutions kind of built on top of it. How do you go from I always like to talk to product people because I think it helps all of us kind of define how to build, but how do you kind of think about the user experience, creating solutions that are simple, but, with a lot of complex tasks and not to overwhelm people, which I think it's kind of the balance. How do you go and approach that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the art and science of product management, isn't it? And as an aside, I actually believe that right now, this is the skill that is, in a way, most lacking in AI. We see a lot of research labs come out with very cool models, but I think the next thing is we're going to see product teams actually build full end-to-end products around these models. So, the way you do it is really, again, there's an art and a science, but the typical framework is that you do a ton of research to define, there's this framework that's called the double diamond framework. And so think of it as two diamonds, like two squares that are rotated 45 degrees, one after the other. And the first one is the diamond of the problem, and the second one is the diamond of the solution. And so the diamond of the problem, each diamond, at first you open it and then you close it. So the diamond of the problem is you open wide the aperture and you talk with your users about what kind of problems they're having, and you try to wrap your head around the problem space. And then you close the diamond, which is you really decide to narrow it down on a few problems, 1, 2, maximum 3. And you really define these problems super clearly. And then you do the same thing for the solutions. Like, hey, okay, now that we've got an idea about the problem space, how do we go about solving this problem? And same here, you open wide, you come up with a bunch of ideas, and then you close and you decide exactly how you're going to solve this problem, and you define it super clearly. I actually think that when you're building a startup, there is a third diamond that is even before the problem diamond, which is the user diamond. And so you actually talk to a bunch of different verticals and types of users, and you try to figure out where new technology that is coming about is most useful. And then once you've defined your ICPs, then you narrow down the kind of problems that they're having.
Yeah, that definition, though, it is a little difficult if you see, say, a lot of problems in a certain particular sector, especially what you're working on at Lindy, being that you can go and utilize AI in so many different ways along the life cycle of someone's workflow. How do you define that initial problem? Is it simply, I have a sample of X amount of users that have this particular problem versus this set of users that have a lesser problem in a different area? So I'm going to focus on the larger kind of population section. Is that kind of how you define it based on amount of impact in a particular group? Or is it the difficulty, the challenge of the problem? How do you kind of define what to focus on first?
Yeah, there lies, again, it's part art, part science, but I think you need to find something that is simultaneously aligned with your long-term vision and that is viable over the short term. So if you think about it as climbing the Everest, you're looking for a base camp on your way there where you can rest. And so that's what you're looking for. You're looking for like the best base camp that is on your way to the Everest. And I think one tricky thing one trap that founders sometimes fall into is that they find the base camp that is not aligned. It's not in the Everest. It's like another mountain. And they go after it. And like, if it's not on the way to the Everest, why are you going after it? You want to climb the Everest, right? And so, yeah, I mean, there's multiple ways to go about it. So one is problem first and the other is solution first. And so the solution first approach is, hey, this new technology that is seeing the light now, what is it uniquely good at? And what is it that needs these things that it's uniquely good at? For example, Jeff Bezos did that with Amazon. He was like, hey, the everything store, e-commerce, what is it uniquely good at? Well, there is infinite shelf space. Okay, so what is it that's got infinite SKUs? Oh, books. There's a lot of books, and also they have infinite shelf life. So boom, it's a perfect fit for this new paradigm, right? So in our case, we were like, hey, what is AI really good at? Well, AI is really good at processing information and now actually performing actions. And so we were like, okay, who is in the business of processing information and performing actions all the time? And again, in the spirit of base camps that are not on your way to the Everest, we actually identified also law and finance. So financial analysts are in the business of analyzing troves of information. Lawyers are in the business of generating contracts, and in the discovery process, they have thousands of pages of documents to read and to extract information from. And we actually found an opportunity there. We're like, oh wow, like lawyers were like begging us to give them something here. And then we were like, you know what? It's not really a wedge into our long-term vision, which is our long-term vision is we want to automate all knowledge work, right? And no doubt, law and finance are big categories of knowledge work, but we more and more realized that those weren't wedges into our long-term visions. Those were entire categories in and of themselves. In the same way that like Amazon doesn't sell houses, right? You go to Zillow for that, right? So eventually we ended up landing on executive assistants. So that is where we found an opportunity where we were like, hey, it's pretty well defined. People who want help with their calendar, with their email, with their meeting recording and note taking and so forth. It's very tractable and it is very aligned with the long-term vision.
Yeah. And what in particular, when you think about knowledge, you said knowledge work, how would you define that? What is knowledge work? And does everybody kind of have this knowledge work in some different variation? I'm curious about that. I haven't heard that vocabulary before.
Yeah. Any work that can be done behind a computer that could be done by a remote worker is knowledge work. You're manipulating information all day. And so effectively as a human, you are a function sitting between input and output. And your input is your screen and your output is your keyboard and you're a function. And so AI, I think, will eventually become very good at approximating that function.
Yeah. And thinking about just backtracking a little bit, you were at Uber and then you kind of started to build things around teams and the kind of workflow processes. What particularly got you interested in that, being that you could have gone so many different directions? What was the catalyst or inspiration for starting out and starting to build a startup when you worked for arguably one of the larger companies, at least in the Bay Area and globally at the time?
Yeah, I would actually pose the question the other way around. Is why did I work at Uber if I wanted to build a startup? Because that's actually what happened. To me, building a startup was always the goal. And I actually viewed Uber as a stepping stone for that. So when I arrived in San Francisco, I was 20 and I had a checklist of 4 items that I wanted before I started a company. And it was, I wanted, number 1, a green card. I wanted money, savings. I wanted skills, and I wanted a network. Those were the 4 items that I wanted to check. And by the way, in hindsight, I think I placed the bar too high. Frankly, in hindsight, I wish I had pulled the trigger earlier and started a company earlier. But eventually, so I joined Uber and I started steering my career in a direction that I knew was aligned with this vision of being a founder. And so that's why I went from being an engineer at Uber to being a product manager. Because I actually think that this is what prepares you best inside a big company to become a founder. So I became a PM. And I do think I learned a lot. It's not exactly like being a founder, obviously, but it comes closest inside a big company. And little by little, I checked these 4 boxes. And I was like, all right. And at some point, I felt ready. And again, frankly, I think I waited 1 or 2 years too long, but oh well. And eventually, when I felt ready, I just did it.
Yeah. And thinking about that experience at Uber, what are some things that you saw them that they were doing well that you carried over into your other companies that kind of offered maybe some maturity to whether the construction operations or the efficiency or effectiveness, being that you worked at such a hyper-growth company? Anything that you carried over that was useful to implement at your other companies?
Yeah, so much. I think there are 2 or 3 big things that I learned from Uber. The first one is the value of ownership.
Yeah.
The thing I learned at Uber is that no one's going to help you and no one's going to stop you either. I see Uber is really good at taking 22 years old and giving them entire business lines and telling them, you go do this. Here's $5 million. And you're like, me? Like, who? Like me? And he's like, yeah, you. And it's like, so that's another thing I learned is that works. You can actually give people an insane amount of ownership and people step up. Even very young, very inexperienced people, it's just mind-blowing what people can achieve when you give them autonomy and high expectations and you hold them accountable. So the value of hustle as well, the value of resourcefulness, I think Uber is really good at that. The value of being extremely fast-moving, faster than feels reasonable, frankly.
Yeah.
I think the value of a culture, so some of the values at Uber back then at least were meritocracy and toe-stepping. And what those stand for, and there was another one that was truth-seeking. And so what they stand for is like, when you're in a room, it's not the person with the biggest title who wins the conversation. It's the person with the best ideas. And you see these people, you see people in meeting with Travis speak up to him and not be afraid of speaking up to him. And Travis would actually encourage that. He would get into a debate with you, right?
Sure.
And I saw that all the time. And it was very much encouraged to speak up and engage in heated debates even sometimes, because the most important thing was for truth to come out.
Yeah.
And that's been a huge learning as well.
Yeah, the values really steer kind of how the company kind of acts, or when you don't have, say, an objective, or you're looking for an objective, what are our in-line values? How do we work? How do we communicate with each other? What are we seeking out? And it kind of detaches the individual from the overall company or project or product, which you can see so much, a lot of companies having success by aligning in that direction. Thinking about Lindy, what in particular was exciting about AI and when you started building it, and how is it kind of, I get evolved now that AI is kind of almost, it's a household concept now that a lot of people can access and engage with. How was it when you first started building a company, and what's changed now since all the popularity has really gained traction and put a lot of spotlight on this technology?
Yeah. I think AI has given us really impressive demos for a very long time. So I really started to get in AI, as many people after the ImageNet moment, which I believe was like 10 years ago or something like that. And like for the first time, AI became really good at image recognition. And like, that's when I started paying attention. I was like, wow, like something is happening there. And then I actually came close to starting an AI startup after GPT-2 came out, actually. And back then, my idea was I wanted to start something like an enterprise search solution based on GPT-2. And I played with it actually quite a bit, and I ended up concluding that the technology was not quite there yet. But it was always in the corner of my eye. I have many friends in AI. I've always like stayed very close to it. And then GPT-3 came out, and then ChatGPT. And I think, frankly, it took everyone by surprise what RLHF could do to these models, like the kind of capabilities that it could unlock. And that's when, for us, it was like an holy cow moment. It was really like, this is the technological revolution of our lifetimes. It's just extremely obvious. And you get sucked in to it almost, you almost don't want to get sucked in, and you get sucked into it anyway. Yeah, it's hard not to get sucked in. It's just the possibilities are endless.
Yeah. And describe to the audience, to give a little bit more context, what Lindy does, to describe the product and what the user experience is. If I'm somebody who uses Lindy, what does that look like in my day-to-day functioning? And at what positive or I guess productive outcomes should I be able to kind of measure or receive or acknowledge when working with the tool versus not?
Right. So what Lindy does is she's a personal AI assistant that takes care of your email, your calendar, and your meetings. At first, those are the things she does very well. Now she can do a lot more than that, but those are the things she does very, very well right now. When you use Lindy, the idea is that it puts your work on autopilot. So it takes care of all the menial tasks in your work such that everything just flows seamlessly. You don't have to worry about any of the logistical work anymore. People are much too clever to be spending their time spending calendar invites, right? For example, or taking notes during meetings. You should keep the high capabilities of your brain to do what it's uniquely good at. So for example, when you use Lindy, you wake up in the morning, you open your Gmail inbox, for example, and this is to your email or pre-drafted in your inbox. And they are pre-drafted using what Lindy knows about you and what she has learned about your voice. And she actually tailors your voice based on how you speak to each recipient. So hopefully you don't speak the same way to an investor as you do to your partner. And so it is going to draft emails with that in mind. She's going to triage your emails to let you know which ones are most important to pay attention to right now. She's going to join your meetings and take notes during your meetings. So at the end of your meeting, you can send a summary email. Or if you say during your meeting, like, hey, let's capture this as an action item, she's going to send that afterwards. Or you can say, hey, let's meet tomorrow again at 3. She's going to send the calendar invite and so on and so forth. So today, it just makes your life and your work way easier in a myriad ways. Our very long-term vision, again, is to automate knowledge work. We want Lindy to be like another employee in your company, except she works at superhuman speed and sits on every meeting in your company, has read every email, every document, and can just perform an insane amount of work for you and your company.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to think about the amount of things that it can handle and thinking about the amount of freedom that you have after that, free time, and do other tasks that are a little bit maybe more high level or a little bit more involved with other moving parts. But describe one thing I'm interested in is how do you create a platform that communicates with other software, whether you work on different calendars or you schedule meetings through different course. What is the challenge around building a platform that integrates all these other softwares? And is there any software that unfortunately gets left out because of certain restrictions or certain maybe lack of capabilities? Maybe there's an API that plugs into the model. How do you create something that, I guess, works with everything else?
Yeah, I mean, today, Lindy integrates with pretty much anything that has an API. And soon she will be able to integrate with things that don't have an API too, because we're also working on making her be able to manipulate user interfaces.
Yeah.
So building these integrations is actually not the challenge. It's actually pretty awesome because we use Lindy to build these integrations. So she builds her own integrations based only on the documentation of these APIs.
Yeah.
Which actually leads to some surprises from time to time. Like, for example, recently we asked her to send a positive message to the general channel on Slack. And she did that. She was like, hey, everybody, today's a new day with infinite possibilities. And she changed her profile picture on Slack. And not only had we not asked her to do that, but we actually didn't even know that there was an API endpoint to do that. So she actually has capabilities that we don't even know about. So the challenge is not as much in building the integrations as much as it is in teaching Lindy how to use these integrations and in what order. So that's what we do. And the way Lindy does that today is when you ask something to Lindy, she writes a piece of code to perform that task for you.
Yeah.
Which I actually think is endlessly interesting because effectively what's going on is that you get a mini app that is dedicated just to the one session that you have right now.
Yeah.
And when you close your tab, effectively that mini app gets deleted. Which I always compare that to the Industrial Revolution, because before the Industrial Revolution, goods were very expensive, right? If you think about it, a cup was very expensive, a pen was very expensive. These things would be $500 or something. After the Industrial Revolution, they got so cheap that we got disposable versions of these items. So like the solo cap, the big pen, and so forth. I think the same thing is happening to code right now. So code right now, an average application costs, say, $100,000. We are rapidly approaching a world where these applications actually cost 1 cent or 10 cents. They are actually so cheap that you can get single-use applications just for the one session that you are using right now. So for example, I could be like, hey, Lindy, show me my calendar events. And she's going to show me a list of calendar events. And I'm like, no, show them to me on the map. And she's going to render a Google map with my calendar events so I can see where my meetings are for that day.
Yeah.
First of all, this is something that I don't know of a single application that does that. So I'm getting an application just for this session that is tailored just for my specific use case right now, which I think is just mind-blowing.
Wow, it's so fascinating to think about how it's training itself to integrate with these applications and utilize and almost act like it's like a small dev team or full stack developer being able to quickly iterate and integrate with all these technologies. One thing that I think about is the model building and how that's advanced in a lot of different ways to train these AI systems to be able to be more sophisticated and on target with the requests that you're submitting to it, right, or generating or asking of it. How is the models advanced and where are those models coming from? Are they coming from teams? Are they coming from other industries that are doing a lot of investment into the types of models? Where does that information come from, and how more quickly and rapidly are they advancing into the understanding of how to complete tasks and cooperate and work with humans as we go through our day-to-day?
Yeah. these models are coming from a lot of different places. So some of them are being open sourced by very big research labs. The biggest ones right now, the biggest research labs are going to be DeepMind, Fair from Facebook or Meta, OpenAI. Obviously, though, they are not open sourcing their large language models. So these big labs are releasing models, and then the open source communities as a whole is also releasing models and training models like Stable Diffusion, and there are smaller ones as well. So what we do, we spend a lot of time keeping abreast of the latest models and constantly evaluating them. So we've built our own what's called an eval suite, so a way to evaluate these different models based on our given use case. And so we spend a lot of time, and we've built a lot of tooling and infrastructure to constantly test these models and see how they're performing. And then we take these models as a base and we fine-tune them for our use case. So we also spend a lot of time and money and effort bringing together a data set. So we have a very large data set of tasks and how to perform them best from a lot of different sources. And we use this data set to fine-tune and train these models. And so not only that, but we also have a little bit of a hybrid system where we actually have different models that are specialized in different tasks, like entering a dialogue with the user, answering factual questions, browsing the web, writing code. So we have different models for these different things. And we've built a sort of community of models, if you will, that work with each other in order to perform the task that is given to them by the user.
Yeah. And what's the challenge in thinking about a lot of companies are using AI in one way, shape, or form. We have Jasper AI is doing a lot around content and helping kind of disrupt kind of the writer's block and all that kind of. And then ChatGPT, kind of an all-around tool where you're able to ask questions to generate. We have Lindy, who's able to take a huge load of the workload that is just unnecessary for people to do and automate that in a process that's seamless and in your own voice. What's going to be the challenge in whether it's this year or in the next couple of years around differentiating but utilizing AI and similar AI systems for companies, being that now we're seeing a huge kind of boom and almost like a red ocean of competition with a lot of different companies and how they utilize AI. What do you kind of predict for not only Lindy, but for the overall industry in this next evolution of AI and tools that come along with it?
Yeah, I think it's Nat Friedman who recently tweeted something like, and I actually agree with him, that the tech community has become overly focused on modes.
Yeah,
I see too many founders spend too much time talking about strategy instead of tactics. I feel like startups live in tactics land. You are in the business of surviving for the next 3 months, right? And look, at the end of the day, the reality is that as a startup who just raised a seed round and you have 5 or 10 people building something, you don't have a moat. Because if you had a moat, then so did the next guy next to you, because you don't have any structural advantage at that point, and so that means that you don't have a moat. And so all that really means is that you're in an execution play. Your job is to build the most insanely awesome product that you can, and do that faster and better than the next guy, and good enough that it beats the competition. This is often talked about 10x. It's going to be 10x better than the competition to overcome the habit of using the competition. In this case, there isn't much of an incumbent yet. Perhaps OpenAI is what comes closest, but the field is still so new. So you're in an execution game. You just got to nail down the execution. So in that respect, I don't think building an AI is very different from building in any other field. Perhaps building an AI is different insofar as you are operating at the bleeding edge of technology.
Sure.
And so there isn't as much of a playbook. Everything is changing very, very rapidly. The models are changing. The best ways to build are changing. The paradigm, the entire framework is changing all the time. And so I think that a lot of things will seem obvious to people 5 or 10 years from now that today are absolute mysteries. Just in the same way that today, things like cloud, right? This idea of you have code running on the server and it hits up a front end, and you've got Python on the back end and JavaScript on the front end, and like some code that gets executed in different parts of the stack. Today, for us, it's very obvious. It took the industry decades to discover that. So I think it's going to be the same thing with AI, except the playbook is still being figured out, and what goes on at what parts of the stack is still being figured out. And it is a very challenging tech to build with. So that is the added level of difficulty here. But otherwise, again, you're basically in an execution play, which is the same game as any startup.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about the traction that Lindy has so far. What are you particularly excited about your initial launch? And then what are you particularly excited about the future and the different goals that you have set for this year and beyond?
Yeah. The launch that we did a few weeks ago went super well. So we've accumulated more than 10,000 signups to the waiting list. When people sign up to the waiting list, we ask them for their willingness to pay. And obviously only a subset of those are going to convert and so forth. But right now in the waiting list, we have many millions of dollars of willingness to pay. And I personally have never seen this amount of market pool, except perhaps at Uber, where I have gotten dozens of people reach out to me, begging me to let them through the waiting list. I've actually gotten friends who received all the reach outs because people knew that they knew me. And they were like, hey, you ask Flo to let me through the wait list. I've never received it. I've never seen anything like that before. It's just like an insane amount of market pool. Certainly, I think a lot of that is also a function of the current AI moments that we're going through. What I'm excited about is just to see this product become real. It's already very good. Like I use it all the time. It's really good. And I think it's going to become even better over the next 3, 6, 12 months. I'm just excited for this kind of product to exist, frankly. It's going to be so insanely good and it's going to make such a difference in people's lives.
It's incredible. Honestly, the biggest change is the velocity that things are being done at, whether it's on the individual level or by companies, as you mentioned. Things are just being done so rapidly, so quickly that we've just never seen this level of progress or the speed of progress in so long, let alone, I don't think ever. I mean, I can't imagine, what's impacted in the last few months, that speed is so different than I think anything historically. Thinking about just AI and whether it's internal or external and thinking about Lindy, what are some of the biggest risks that you think the company faces today?
I think the biggest risk is going to be internal. I think, can we execute? Can we build this? Can we build this good enough, fast enough, better than the competition? That's what I'm worried about. To your point about things are moving very fast right now, yes, it is really mind-blowing. Like I think AI is going to change absolutely everything. I think it is a much bigger deal than the iPhone, a much bigger deal than even the internet. I think it's Larry Summers who said it's more similar to inventing of the wheel or fire. And I think it's a transformative invention. Now, the funny thing is that when you look back at history, if you look, for example, at the time window between 1900 and 1930, I'll give a short list of inventions that happened between these 30 years. The car, the radio, the television, penicillin, the vaccine, plastics, plane. That was in 30 years, right? Plastics. I'll just pause on this for a minute. Electricity. These things are huge deal. That was 30 years, right? What happened in the last 30 years between 1990 and 2020, right? So that's the whole Peter Thiel great stagnation theory, and I wholly subscribe to it. Like the internet and smartphones are great. Like the high water mark here was Uber. Like the biggest change it had to our physical world was Uber, which is awesome. But it's at the end of the day, it's people driving people in their cars. And that's the best we've had in the last 30 years. Before my late grandmother passed away, and she was surprisingly up to speed on the latest technological advances. Like she was ordering from Amazon and all of that stuff. And I was like smugly asking her, hey, grandma, what do you think of the internet and the smartphone? And I was expecting to be like, oh, it's amazing. And progress is moving so fast. And she was actually saying, I grew up without running water or electricity. I had no fridge. I had none of that stuff. Like my toilet was a hole in the garden. And so I remember when we got our first fridge. I remember when we got running water. I remember that stuff. So the internet is great, but it's no run. So anyway, I think my point is that human memory is very short. And so, yes, we are living through a historical transition right now, but it's hardly the first one. And I actually think, surprisingly, perhaps that has been the norm through human history is to live through this kind of rapid changes. And I'm excited to join the rest of humanity in living through one of these changes myself.
If everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for Lindy?
I think it's going to automate knowledge work. I think in an immense amount of prosperity, and I think it can change the way people work and businesses work and the way capitalism operates. Always like this next section, I call them on Founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and then we'll see where we get. So first question, I would like to open it up with, what's particularly hard about your job? The surface area is huge. So you get punched in the gut by employees, investors, customers, competitors, whether past, present, or future ones. So that right here, there's like 12 different categories of things that punch you in the gut. And so you get punched in the gut pretty much multiple times a day. And sometimes you have like 5 of those back to back to back to back. And it just sucks. So you get used to it, but it's not very pleasant. So
What's one thing you now as a founder that you wish you learned earlier on?
Premature scaling is the root of all evil. Well, you're ready to scale.
And when do you know you're ready?
You know it. If you got to ready.
Yeah. What's something that you spend too much time on that you would like to spend less? And what was something that you spend little time on that you would like to spend more?
If I knew, I would do it. I don't know. That's a question I ask myself, and I constantly reprioritize my time to spend less time on things that I can spend time on, and more time on things that I spend time on. So I spend an immense amount of time these days hiring and building the product with the team, and I think those are the right things to spend time on.
Yeah. Being a founder, especially within today's climate, we have a lot going on, right? We think about financial infrastructure. We have a lot of cryptocurrency that's and a lot of generative AI and so many different things that we haven't had in the past to consider as founders. How do you kind of go about not only learning and kind of obtaining information and applying it to your company? What's that process like? And how do you kind of balance out building plus learning the new information that's out there to make sure that you're up to date and up to speed on what other companies and your clients are dealing with, which is a challenge. Kind of, it's like two different positions in one. But what in particular do you do to kind of manage that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you've got to be deliberate about how you manage your information diet. Mm-hmm. And I think that you cannot totally isolate yourself as a founder. It is sometimes tempting to go in what I call the cave. And you just go head down and you close everything and you just build your own product. And then at some point, 12 or 24 months later, you poke up your head and the world has changed and you had no idea. So you can't do that. But the way I do it is I am addicted to Twitter, perhaps too much. I spend, perhaps I saw your previous question. That is perhaps one thing where I spend too much time. So it's Twitter. And I'm deliberate about who I follow on Twitter. And right now it's a lot of AI. And I think Twitter has this nice property where it is addicting. And so if you can somehow make learning fun because you follow people who are tweeting about things that you want to learn about.
Yeah. I would like to ask this question because I love how founders kind of extract knowledge from anything that they ingest. But whether it's early in your career or now, what books or people have influenced you the most?
It's going to sound cliche, but it's very cliche. But it's Steve Jobs, Charlie Munger, Elon Musk. I sound like such a stereotype right now, but I think I learned from Steve Jobs the importance of vision and creation and like the existential importance of these things. It's like you're gonna make money. And even if you don't make money, money is not important enough to sacrifice your creative potential as a human. Yeah. I learned that. From Elon, I'm learning to think big and for yourself. And from Charlie Munger, I think I've learned the importance of, I think he talks about, it is more important to remember the obvious than to figure out the arcane. Like here I'm talking, like, you're asking, how do you differentiate yourself as a founder? And I'm like, just drop all the MBA. Just build a great, awesome product.
Right.
Obsess with customers and build an awesome product. There isn't much more to it than that. You just got to, like, the most important thing is to keep that in mind and not to figure out the arcane.
Yeah, I love that. And I know we're coming to the close of the episode, and I always like to give people a chance to give us your plugs and give our audience an idea of where to support you. But before we do that, I want to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table. Is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have or that you would have liked to answer? Anything comes to mind?
No, this is great. I greatly enjoyed the conversation.
I appreciate it, Flo. And last little bit is where can we find you? Where can we find Lindy? Give us your website, your LinkedIn. Where can we support you in the business? And also Twitters. Give it all to us so we can come and support you.
Yeah, the website is lindy.ai. The Twitter is getlindy, and my personal Twitter is Altimor, Altimor.
Flo, it's been such a pleasure not only chatting about your early experience in your career, how you view product and building, but also currently Lindy and kind of the new generation of this whole AI movement and what it means to everyone. I think it's not necessarily impacting one individual or one type of profile. It's everyone, and everyone kind of get the opportunity to use advanced tools like this to make their job either less mundane or more sophisticated in a lot of different ways. So it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I hope you enjoyed yourself on Behind Company Lines. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Julian.
Of course.